You people always think you're the exception, don't you? He said that with a chuckle right before I made his courtroom erupt into stunned silence. My name is Nia Carter. I was 23 when I walked into Judge Raymond Whitaker's courtroom, dressed in my only clean blazer, clutching a yellow notepad stained with coffee. I wasn't on trial. I was a third-year law student observing proceedings for academic credit. But from the moment I stepped inside, he looked at me like I was the defendant. That morning, my professor had encouraged me to speak up if I had legal observations. Courtroom dynamics are your training ground, she said, but she didn't know what it felt like to have every eye turn on you, not because of your words, but because of your skin. Interns stay silent unless spoken to. Judge Whitaker barked the second I clear my throat. We run this court by the Constitution, not the culture wars. I hadn't even spoken yet. The air in courtroom 2B was stale and heavy with the musk of old files and older opinions. The judge, silver-haired and smug, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Are you even from this country?" he asked casually, not even bothering to mask the scorn. "Or are you here to protest your way into a degree?" I said nothing. I sat back down. I stayed the rest of the day, fists clenched under the table. I wrote his comments in the margins of my notebook right next to a quote I'd copied from Thurgood Marshall. In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. I told myself I'd speak soon. Not in whispers, not in defense, but with law. 2 weeks later it happened. The defendant in case 4867, Marlon King, was a young black man facing 5 years for a minor drug possession charge. No prior offenses. Arrested during a routine traffic stop, no warrant, no probable cause. The prosecutor, a young white assistant DA, fresh out of Yale, kept saying urban tendencies like it was a legal term. I watched Judge Whitaker lean back, hands folded. "Mr. King, given your background, this is no surprise." Background? Marlon had a job, a family, and not even a parking ticket before that night. I stood. "Excuse me, Your Honor." He didn't look up. "Sit down, Ms. Carter. Or do I need to remind you again of your role?" My heart thundered. "My role is to uphold the law, sir." That made him pause. For a long beat, the courtroom was silent. My professor, seated 2 rows behind in blink. The prosecutor scoffed. The public defender looked up with tired, grateful eyes. I walked slowly to the front. "Ms. Carter," the judge said, his voice colder now, "if you're not sworn in, you don't speak." "I request to be sworn in as amicus curiae," I said clearly. "I've filed an emergency motion to intervene based on constitutional violations I've documented in this court." There were gasps. Even the clerk shifted nervously. Whitaker stared at me. "You what?" "Filed it 10 minutes ago with the clerk. Time stamped and logged." "Sir." He didn't believe me. He motioned to the bailiff. The folder was retrieved. He read the motion. His lips tightened. "Violation of the Fourth Amendment. Racial profiling. Statistical disparities in sentencing by this court," he read aloud. I waited. Silent. Steady. Every part of me trembling, but I stood. Then he laughed. "You wrote this? You think a student with a chip on her shoulder can challenge 25 years of my jurisprudence?" "I think the Constitution already has, sir," I said quietly. The gallery stirred. Journalists started scribbling. The public defender gave me a tiny nod. He slammed the motion onto his desk. Denied. Motion lacks standing. But it was too late. The moment went viral. Someone had recorded it. By nightfall, it was on every law forum in the country. Black law student challenges sitting judge with filed motion on racial bias. Is justice colorblind in Pennsylvania courts? I got hate mail, of course, but I also got emails from professors at Columbia, from defense attorneys in Georgia, from Marlon's mother. "I never thought someone in that room would speak up for him," she wrote. They reviewed Marlon's case again. this time with another judge. Verdict overturned. Unlawful stop. Charges dropped. And me? I got called into a hearing by the state bar to determine if I'd violated any student codes. Judge Whitaker sat at that hearing, this time not as judge but as a witness. I stood again, not as a defendant, not as a protestor, but as a legal mind armed with precedent and purpose. I recited every word of that motion without looking down. Every statute, every ruling, every case that proved his patterns weren't coincidence, they were discrimination disguised as decorum. By the time I finished, Judge Whitaker stared at me, not with scorn, not even anger, just silence. The committee cleared me of any wrongdoing. They called my action risky but necessary. But what stayed with me wasn't that ruling. It was the way he looked at me, speechless, finally. The silence of a man who had never expected a black woman to know the law better than he did. And yet, there I was. I didn't win that day because I yelled. I won because I refused to stay quiet. Because justice, when spoken clearly, can silence even the oldest voice in the room. And I was just getting started. That semester, everything changed. Suddenly, professors who barely acknowledged me in class were calling on me, quoting my motion, asking me to share a few words about what it felt like to challenge a federal judge, as if I hadn't been sitting in their classrooms for 3 years raising my hand, as if I hadn't been crafting the same level of arguments before anyone thought to pay attention. But I wasn't flattered. I was focused. A legal aid clinic in North Philadelphia reached out. They were overloaded with racial bias cases and said they needed a fighter. I agreed to help 2 nights a week. I didn't know then that one of those cases would bring me back face to face with Whitaker. His name reappeared on a docket I was reviewing one evening. Case 5990, People v. Deshaun Green. 17 years old. Caught with a vape pen laced with THC. First offense. Prosecutors were pushing for adult charges again. I sat with Deshaun in a cold room at the juvenile center. He wouldn't look at me at first. Said it didn't matter who his lawyer was because the game is fixed. You ever heard of Judge Whitaker? I asked. He looked up slowly. Old white, dude who calls every kid from my block a criminal before he even hears him talk. I nodded. Yeah, I made him shut up once. He blinked. No way. I smiled. Way. For the next few weeks, we built his case together. I found evidence that the arresting officer had overstepped his authority. The stop was illegal. I drafted memos late into the night, lining up precedent like soldiers. When I walked into Whitaker's courtroom again, it wasn't as a student. I had just passed the bar exam. I wore my best suit, though the sleeves were still a little long. I carried 2 binders, my nerves tucked neatly behind them. Whitaker glanced at me as I approached the defense table. He blinked, then narrowed his eyes. Miss Carter, he said. Or should I say, Counselor Carter now? I nodded. That's correct, Your Honor. He smirked. Well, I suppose they'll let anyone in these days. There were few chuckles from the gallery. I didn't smile. I opened my binder. Motion to dismiss all charges based on lack of probable cause and unconstitutional search, Your Honor. He raised his eyebrows. Again, this is my first time submitting this motion in this courtroom, sir. He leaned forward. What exactly are you trying to prove, Miss Carter? That the Constitution doesn't have footnotes for skin color. He stared at me for a long moment. The room was silent. Then he spoke. Proceed. And I did. I walked through the timeline. The officer who pulled Deshaun over claimed his taillight was out. Body cam footage showed it wasn't. The search was conducted without consent, without reasonable suspicion, and without backup. I cited case after case Terry v. Ohio, Delaware versus Prowse, Wren versus United States. I showed how the officer had a history of over-policing black youth. I used his own department's internal records, obtained through a Freedom of Information request. When I finished, I didn't look at Whitaker. I looked at Deshawn. For the first time since I met him, he was smiling. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. The courtroom was quiet for nearly a full minute. "Motion granted," he said finally. "Charges dismissed." There was an audible gasp in the room. Deshawn whispered, "No way," under his breath. Whitaker gathered his papers. "Counselor Carter," he said slowly, "you're a formidable presence in this courtroom. I'll grant you that." I simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Outside, reporters were waiting. I didn't stop for interviews. I walked Deshawn out the front steps. His mom ran up and wrapped him in a hug so tight, I thought they might both collapse. "You saved my son," she whispered to me, tears in her eyes. "No, ma'am," I said. "He saved himself. I just made sure the system didn't bury him." From that moment on, the phone never stopped ringing. I was asked to speak at seminars on racial justice, to consult on wrongful conviction cases, to guest lecture at schools that once ignored people like me. I kept accepting the invitations not for the claps, but for the message. One night, I got a call from Judge Whitaker's clerk. "The judge has requested a meeting," she said. I hesitated. "Did he say why?" "He said you want to hear what he has to say." I almost declined, but I went. His chambers were wood-paneled and solemn, just like the man himself. He poured 2 glasses of water and gestured to a seat. "I've reviewed your work," he said slowly. "Your motions, your arguments, your record is impressive." "Thank you," I said, unsure where this was going. He looked down, then back up. "I was raised in a world where black meant criminal. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I enforced law the way I was taught. But you," he paused. "You reminded me of the law the way it was written, not the way it was inherited." I stayed silent. He took a breath. "I've decided to retire early. Effective this year. I'll be recommending you to fill a judicial clerkship under the circuit court. You're not just sharp, you're necessary." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get. And maybe it was enough. Because not long after that, I stood on the steps of the Pennsylvania Circuit Courthouse, holding a letter that made it official. I was a judicial clerk, the first black woman to hold that specific position in our district. I looked out at the city below, its skyline jagged, its streets cracked, its people fighting to be seen, and I whispered to myself, "You're just getting started." Because I wasn't done. Not until every courtroom heard the voices they tried to silence. Not until the benches were filled with faces that understood struggle and justice in the same breath. Not until no student ever had to stand up and shout to be heard. I had become the voice I once needed. And now I was becoming the judge I never had. The first day of my clerkship felt strangely quiet. No gavel slams. No outbursts. Just the rustle of paper and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But beneath the surface, power stirred. I worked under Judge Rosalind Merriweather, one of the few black women on the Pennsylvania Circuit Court. She was fierce, methodical, and possessed a razor-sharp legal mind. In my first week, she handed me a stack of appellate briefs taller than my coffee thermos and said, "This is the work. Glamour comes later." I respected her instantly. The cases were tougher here. Appeals for life sentences, wrongful convictions, police misconduct. Some were gut-wrenching. A man imprisoned for 23 years based on a single eyewitness who later recanted. A woman sentenced for defending herself from an abusive partner. I pored through transcripts, scanned case law, scribbled notes and margins, wrote summaries long after the courthouse had emptied for the night. Each brief I touched wasn't just a stack of pages, it was someone's life. Then came State versus Harding, and I knew it would change everything. Marcus Harding was a high school principal, arrested for allegedly embezzling school funds. The media had plastered his mugshot everywhere, labeling him the fraud educator. But the audit trail told a different story. There were inconsistencies, The funds had been rerouted, yes, but not to his account. The actual account belonged to a foundation linked to a white school board official who'd mysteriously resigned 2 days after Harding's arrest. I flagged it to Judge Merriweather. She read my summary, then looked at me over her glasses. "Write me the argument you'd make if you were on the bench," she said. "Don't hold back. Don't soften it." I stayed up the entire weekend. I pulled property records, tracked donation trails, even called an old contact at the Department of Education. By Monday, I handed her a 17-page memo with case law, timeline, motive, and suggested action. She read it silently, then handed it back. "We're unsealing this in court." I blinked. "Wait, we are?" "No," she said. "You are." At first, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She motioned to her law clerk's seat. "You've done the work. You'll present it with me on the record. You earned that right." The courtroom was packed that day. Local media, community members, even a few law professors I recognized for back at Penn. I stood beside Judge Merriweather as she opened the hearing. "Before we proceed," she said into the microphone, "my law clerk, Counselor Nia Carter, has brought forward newly discovered evidence that materially affects the merits of this appeal." Gasps followed. I stepped forward, voice steady but heart racing. I laid it all out. The financial trail, the misdirection, the whistleblower email we had uncovered, the board official's sudden resignation, and finally, the legal precedent that justified dismissing the charges. When I finished, the room was stone silent. Judge Merriweather cleared her throat. "Having reviewed this thoroughly, I find the conviction unsound. The court grants Mr. Harding immediate release. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the conduct of the school board." A cheer erupted from the gallery. Marcus Harding wept into his hands. And me? I stood frozen, not in fear, in awe, not just of the moment, but of what it represented. A black judge, a black clerk, using the law not as a shield for the powerful, but as a sword for the silenced. Afterward, reporters crowded me. I gave one short sentence. "The law is only blind if you force it to look away." Later that night, as I walked back to my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Judge Whitaker. "I saw the ruling, and I saw you. Keep going. You're changing more than court decisions. You're changing the court itself." I didn't know what to feel. Pride? Gratitude? Closure? Maybe all of it. That fall, I began speaking at schools, not just law schools, but high schools, middle schools. I met young girls who looked like me, who didn't know they could be more than defendants or victims. I told them the truth. The system is flawed, but not unchangeable. And sometimes, change looks like a single voice refusing to stay seated. Then, everything escalated. A viral video hit social media. A traffic stop. A young black man pulled from his car, face slammed into the pavement. The officer had no warrant, no cause. The man screamed one thing over and over: "I know my rights." But it didn't stop them. He was charged with resisting arrest. And his case? Assigned to Judge Raymond Whitaker, retired, but recently brought back as a visiting judge. The internet exploded. Protests erupted. I was asked to join the defense team, not lead, just consult. I declined. Instead, I went to the courthouse and filed a judicial ethics complaint. Not because I hated Whitaker, but because we needed consistency in justice. And a man with a history of biased rulings had no place presiding over a racially charged case. It wasn't personal. It was principle. The complaint triggered a review, and the judge was removed from the case. It was a quiet victory, but meant everything. And soon after, I was offered something I never expected: a seat on the Pennsylvania State Commission on Judicial Reform. At 26 years old, I asked myself 100 times, am I ready? Do I deserve this? Is this too soon? But I kept returning to that courtroom, the first one. The day I stood up when I wasn't supposed to. When I challenged a man who wore the robe not because I wanted to fight, but because I wanted fairness. So I said yes. I accepted the position. And in our first meeting, I sat beside federal judges, law professors, and policymakers. One of them, a man with silver hair and piercing eyes, leaned over and said, "You're the young lady who made Whitaker choke on his own words, aren't you?" I smiled. He didn't choke. He listened, because that's what this was always about. Not revenge, but recognition. That a system built to silence us could still be transformed by presence, by persistence, by law. 2 years into the Judicial Reform Commission, I had become something of an anomaly. I was the youngest, the loudest, and most certainly the blackest person in the room. Every time we met in Harrisburg, I'd catch the subtle glances from older colleagues, some patronizing, some curious, and some quietly respectful. We had one goal: to reform the judicial appointment process in Pennsylvania. But beneath the surface, what we were really fighting for was who gets to decide justice. In a closed-door session one Thursday morning, the topic turned to diversity quotas. One of the senior members, a former appellate judge, leaned back in his chair and said, "We shouldn't pick judges based on skin color. The law is neutral." I closed my laptop. "Sir," I said calmly, "if the law were neutral, I wouldn't have had to interrupt a courtroom to be heard." He raised an eyebrow. "I don't want diversity for optics. I want it for accuracy, for representation, for lived experience that shapes how rulings affect people." Another member, an elderly white woman, chimed in softly, "But isn't the danger letting identity drive jurisprudence?" I nodded. "Only if you pretend identity hasn't already been doing that for centuries." Silence. Then someone clapped, and slowly others followed. It wasn't a win. Not yet. But it was movement. Progress, I had learned, doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it's just one voice that doesn't shut up. That summer, the state rolled out the Equal Bench Initiative, our most ambitious reform, a pipeline program for law students of color, LGBTQ+ students, students with disabilities, all of them placed into clerkships, mentored by judges, given the tools to rise. We got pushback. Naturally. One headline read, "Activist clerk turns judiciary into social experiment." I framed it, hung it right next to my law degree, and I kept going. Then a letter arrived. Thick paper, gold seal, signed by the governor. "I am pleased to offer you a nomination to serve as judge for the Court of Common Pleas, Philadelphia County." I stared at the envelope for a long time. The moment felt too big to fit into one breath. I called my mother first. She cried before I could say a word. "I always knew," she whispered. I remembered watching her clean houses after her nursing shifts, falling asleep at the kitchen table helping me with homework, folding my scholarship letters like they were treasure maps. She always believed I'd end up behind a bench, but I never imagined it would come this soon. My confirmation hearing was brutal. They brought up everything. The Whitaker incident, my public speeches, my work with the Reform Commission. One senator leaned forward and said, "Ms. Carter, are you here to serve justice or your own agenda?" I didn't blink. I believe those are the same thing. He frowned. "So you admit you're biased?" "I admit I've lived, and I won't pretend that experience doesn't sharpen my understanding of how justice should be applied." He scribbled something. "Sounds like activism." I smiled. "Sounds like honesty." 2 weeks later, I was confirmed. Unanimously. My first day on the bench, I wore the robe slowly. Let it settle on my shoulders like armor and ancestry. In the mirror, I didn't see a judge. I saw every woman who'd come before me and been told to wait her turn. I saw every student who'd been silenced, every defendant who'd been profiled, every mother who'd begged the system to see her child as human. I saw Nia Carter, and she wasn't waiting anymore. My first case was simple. A misdemeanor shoplifting charge against a young girl named Kira Simmons, 16, caught with 2 packs of diapers and a box of formula. The prosecutor wanted to push it to juvenile court. I looked at the file. Then I looked at Kira. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her public defender whispered something, but I raised my hand. She glanced up, barely above a whisper. My baby didn't have anything to eat. I didn't know what else to do. I nodded. Then I looked at the prosecutor. Is this the justice you wanted to pursue when you entered law school? He didn't answer. Case dismissed, I said. The gavel fell. And for the first time in years, I felt something profound. Stillness. Not silence. Not submission. But the kind of stillness that happens when justice aligns with humanity. The kind that says, you're where you're meant to be. As I rose from my bench that afternoon, I passed a young black intern waiting near the exit. She looked terrified. I smiled. First day? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Then it's the perfect day, I said. She blinked. Sorry. To start rewriting the rules. Months passed. And then the unexpected happened. A letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside it read, I watch you change the room. Not with rage. With truth. I hope to do the same one day. R.W. Whitaker. I hadn't heard from him since the ethics review. The irony didn't escape me. A man who once dismissed my voice now quietly acknowledged its power. I didn't respond. Some messages are best left as echoes. Because this story wasn't his anymore. It wasn't even mine. It belonged to every student who stood when they weren't supposed to. Every defendant who deserved more than a label. Every courtroom waiting for a new rhythm. Not louder. Not angrier. Just unafraid. The day I swore in the next group of judicial interns, I gave them one instruction. When you walk into court, remember this. Your presence isn't permission. It's power. Don't ask to exist. Just exist louder. They clapped. But one young man lingered after. He asked, how did you know you belonged? I thought for a moment. Then I said, because the second someone told me I didn't, I realized I did. And that was the truth. The whole truth. So help me, justice. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.